A heavy thud echoed across the cracked linoleum of Denny's. Jax tightened his grip on his coffee mug, knuckles turning white under faded ink. The air tasted of burnt grease and exhaust fumes. He didn't look up when the uneven scraping of a dragging shoe approached his booth. Hell's Angels didn't share tables, not with strangers, not with kids. "Can I sit with you?" A small voice cracked through the diner's low hum. Jax turned. What stood there shattered every rule he lived by. Rain lashed against the fogged glass of Rusty's skillet, the heavy drops sounding like gravel thrown against a tin roof. Jax stared at the neon open sign buzzing with a faulty, frantic flicker that cast a harsh red glare across his scarred jaw. His heavy leather cut, weighed down by rainwater and the winged death's head patch of the Hell's Angels, clung stubbornly to his broad shoulders. He smelled of highway grime, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of wet motorcycle exhaust. He traced the deep, jagged scratches carved into the formica table with a grease-stained thumbnail. He wasn't a man who sought company. He tolerated the brothers in his chapter, and even that felt like too much noise on most nights. Tonight, after a grueling 300-mile run, his bones ached and his patience was non-existent. A harsh scraping sound dragged across the black and white checkered floor. Scuff, thud. Scuff, thud. Jax didn't turn his head. His heavy combat boots remained planted on the sticky floorboards, his right hand resting inches from the thick handle of a hunting knife sheathed on his belt. He kept his gaze locked on his black coffee, watching the oily film swirl on the dark, bitter surface. The scraping stopped right at the edge of his booth. "Can I sit with you?" The voice was thin, reedy, and entirely out of place in a damp truck stop at 3 a.m. Jax slowly ground his back teeth together. He shifted his eyes without moving his neck, his peripheral vision catching a small silhouette. A kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old. He wore a faded tan corduroy jacket 3 sizes too big, the cuffs rolled back to expose thin, trembling wrists. His left leg was encased in a crude, heavy metal-framed brace that dug mercilessly into the sides of a worn, mud-caked sneaker. Dirt and dried rain smudged his hollow cheeks. "Beat it, kid," Jax grunted. His voice was rough, sounding like 2 cinder blocks grinding together. The boy didn't move. He smelled intensely of wet wool, fear sweat, and dried copper. Blood. Jax finally turned his heavy neck, feeling the satisfying pop of a stiff vertebrae. He leveled a cold, dead-eyed glare that had backed down grown men with shotguns. The kid's hands shook violently, gripping the steel rim of the table so hard his knuckles protruded sharply against his pale skin. But his eyes, a muddy hazel, remained locked onto Jax's. He didn't blink. "I ain't asking for money," the boy whispered, his breath hitching painfully in his narrow chest. "Just a seat." Jax let out a short, forceful exhale through his nose. He scanned the diner. Dozens of empty booths stretched across the room. The sole waitress, an older woman with deep bags under her eyes, wiped down the counter with a dirty rag, pointedly ignoring the interaction. "Plenty of chairs." Jax pointed a thick, heavily tattooed finger toward a row of empty red vinyl stools. "Take one." "They won't look for me if I'm with you," the boy said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. Jax froze. The muscles in his forearms tightened. This wasn't a runaway begging for a plate of pancakes. This was a liability walking on a rusted metal brace. The club didn't do charity, and Jax definitely avoided civilian crossfire. His immediate impulse was to stand up, throw a $5 bill onto the table, and ride out into the freezing storm. It wasn't his problem. He looked at the front door. Nothing but black night and relentless rain outside. He looked back at the kid. The boy's shivering was so intense, it vibrated the table, rattling Jax's coffee cup against its saucer. "Sit," Jax growled, sliding his massive frame over a few inches, the wet leather of his jacket squeaking against the vinyl. The boy scrambled onto the seat opposite him, pulling his braced leg up with a sharp wince of pain. He shrank back against the cold window pane, trying to fold himself into the shadows. "Who's they?" Jax asked, his voice low. "My stepdad. And his friends." Jax picked up his coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like burnt dirt. He drank it anyway, welcoming the bitterness. He didn't want to know. Every word the kid spoke was a heavy hook, dragging him deeper into a swamp. "What's your name?" "Eric," the boy muttered, his eyes darting toward the diner entrance. "Listen to me, Eric," Jack said, leaning forward, casting a shadow over the small boy. "I finish my coffee. I walk out that door. You stay here. We don't know each other." Eric nodded rapidly, swallowing hard. "Okay, thank you, mister." Jax hated the raw gratitude in the kid's voice. It felt like coarse sandpaper rubbing directly against his nerves. The waitress shuffled over, a steaming glass coffee pot in one hand and a stained, laminated menu in the other. She took one look at Eric's bruised face, then shot a nervous sideways glance at the 1%er diamond patch on Jax's chest. "He with you?" Jax didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the parking lot outside. "Bring him a plate of fries and a tall glass of milk." I don't have money," Eric protested immediately, genuine panic flaring in his chest. He started to slide his good leg out of the booth. "Sit down," Jack snapped. The sharp bark of his tone made the boy flinch violently, pulling his arms over his head in a defensive posture. Jack stopped. A sudden irritating twinge of guilt pricked at the base of his skull. He forcibly softened his voice, lowering the volume. "I'm paying. Shut up and sit." The waitress nodded quickly and backed away toward the kitchen. The heavy scent of frying grease and old meat grew stronger in the air. The silence stretched between the biker and the boy, thick and suffocating. Jax pulled a cigarette from a crushed cardboard pack, sticking it between his dry lips but leaving it unlit. He watched Eric out of the corner of his eye. The boy was tracking every passing headlight on the highway. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. The terror radiating from him was a physical presence in the booth. Jax had seen fear before, the kind that makes men empty their bladders, the kind that begs for mercy on the floor of a warehouse. But this was different. This was the raw, exhausted terror of an animal that had been running its entire life. Jax looked down at his own hands resting on the table. Massive, scarred knuckles, dirt packed under the fingernails. He was a predator by trade. Why was this prey seeking refuge behind a predator? Because the boy, despite his age, understood a fundamental truth of the streets. Sometimes you need a monster to scare away other monsters. The thought left a foul taste in Jax's mouth. He broke bones to collect debts. He didn't play bodyguard over crinkle-cut fries. The waitress returned, hastily sliding a white oval plate across the table. Steam rose from the fries, carrying the sharp, salty scent of hot oil. Eric stared at the food, his stomach letting out a loud, hollow groan that cut through the diner's ambient noise. "Eat," Jax commanded. Eric grabbed a handful of fries. They burned his fingers, but he shoved them into his mouth anyway, chewing with frantic, animalistic desperation. Salt and grease smeared his chin. Jax watched him, his eyes locking onto a dark purple bruise blooming aggressively along the boy's jawline, partially hidden by the oversized corduroy collar. The mark was shaped distinctly like a hand, thick, large fingers. A dark, quiet rage began to pool in the pit of Jax's stomach, hot and uncomfortable. He pushed the feeling down, mentally locking it in a box. "Not my problem." He repeated it in his head. "Not my problem." "You ride?" Eric asked suddenly, his voice muffled by the food. Jack stopped chewing on his unlit cigarette. He raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. I heard it pull up earlier," Eric said, gesturing toward the dark, rain-swept lot with a greasy fry. Sounded angry. "It's an engine, kid. It combusts fuel. It doesn't have feelings." "Everything has feelings," Eric replied softly, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "Some things just yell louder to hide them." Jack stared at the kid. The boy wasn't looking at him anymore. He was intensely focused on arranging his remaining fries. The observation was uncomfortably sharp. It peeled back a layer of armor Jax preferred to keep firmly bolted down. "Why's your leg braced?" Jax asked, deliberately shifting the focus. Eric touched the cold, rusted metal of the brace. "Fell down the stairs. That's what my mom says anyway." The heavy implication hung in the damp air. Jax shifted his weight, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in protest. He knew exactly what it felt like to fall down the stairs. He carried his own childhood scars, buried deep under heavy tattoo ink and slabs of muscle. "Where is she?" "Your mom?" Jax asked, clenching his jaw. He was getting involved. He was crossing his own line. "Sleeping," Eric said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She sleeps a lot when Rick is around. He gives her medicine. Then he gets mad." The narrative was painfully common, yet entirely devastating. "And Rick is looking for you?" Eric nodded, fresh panic tightening his small features. "He found my stash. I was saving money from returning cans, gonna buy a bus ticket for me and Mom. He took it, said I was stealing from his house. He started breaking things in the kitchen. I crawled out the bathroom window when he went for his belt." Jax pictured the cramped, violent scene. The rage, the shattering plates, the boy dragging his heavy braced leg through a small window into the freezing mud. Jax reached into his front pocket and pulled out a thick leather money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and slid it across the sticky table. "Take it," Jax said flatly. "Wait here until the sun comes up, then walk to the station. Don't go back." Eric stared at the green paper. He didn't reach for it. Instead, tears finally welled in his exhausted eyes. "He'll kill her if I don't go back," he told me. He said if I ever ran, he'd take it out on her. Jax's hand froze. The money suddenly felt like useless scrap paper. Running couldn't fix this. The boy wasn't just hiding. He was carrying the literal weight of his mother's survival on his scrawny, bruised shoulders. Before Jax could retract the bill, the heavy double doors of the diner slammed open, hitting the interior wall with a deafening crack. Wind howled into the room, carrying a spray of cold rain and the sharp scent of wet asphalt. The brass bell above the door jingled wildly, an incongruously cheerful sound against the sudden dread. Heavy, mud-caked work boots thudded against the linoleum. Two men stepped out of the storm. The first was tall and heavily built, his beer gut pressing against a tight, grease-stained gray T-shirt. He sported a patchy, unkempt beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The second man was shorter, wiry, with restless, twitchy hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. As they walked in, the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and wet dog filled the diner. Eric didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He simply collapsed inward. He slid down the red vinyl of the booth until only his terrified eyes and the crown of his hair were visible above the table edge. He reached out with a trembling, grease-stained hand and seized the edge of Jax's heavy leather jacket, gripping the material like a lifeline. The tall man stopped abruptly at the counter. The waitress froze, the coffee pot trembling violently in her grip, hot brown liquid spilling onto the floor. "Coffee!" the man barked, his voice thick with alcohol and aggression. "And keep your eyes peeled. Looking for a kid. Got a metal brace on his leg. Little rat ran off." The waitress swallowed hard. She kept her eyes glued to the counter, entirely avoiding the back booth where Jax sat. She just nodded mutely and turned to grab a mug. The tall man, Rick, began to scan the diner. His bloodshot gaze swept over the empty tables, lingered on a sleeping trucker in the corner, and finally settled squarely on the back booth. He saw the broad, unmoving back of the leather jacket, the distinct rocker patches, and the grinning skull. Rick hesitated. Even drunk, he knew Hell's Angels were not to be trifled with. But then his eyes drifted down. He saw the rubber tip of the crutch leaning against the seat. He saw the oversized corduroy sleeve gripping the biker's black leather. A nasty, yellow-toothed grin split Rick's face. He nudged his wiry companion, and the two began walking down the narrow aisle. The heavy, wet thud of their boots felt like a slow, inevitable countdown. Jax didn't turn around. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his cold coffee. He felt Eric's grip on his jacket tighten until the boy's knuckles were grinding painfully against Jax's ribs. "Well, well," Rick sneered, stopping just 2 feet from the booth. "Look who made a friend." Jax slowly set his thick ceramic mug down. It clinked sharply against the saucer. He didn't look up at the men. Instead, he focused on their blurred reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window beside him. "Get up, Eric!" Rick commanded, his voice dripping with venomous authority. "We're going home. Your mother is real worried." Eric let out a microscopic, choked whimper. He remained frozen against the vinyl. "I said get up!" Rick lunged, his thick, calloused fingers grasping aggressively for the collar of the boy's jacket. Jax moved. He didn't stand and he didn't shout. His left hand shot up from the table with terrifying coiled speed, clamping down on Rick's thick wrist like a steel vice. The movement was so abrupt, so brutally violent in its suddenness, that Rick gasped, his forward momentum jarring to a halt. Jax slowly turned his head, looking up at the towering man. Jax's eyes were utterly dead, empty of warmth, empty of rage, just the cold, mechanical calculation of a man assessing the structural weakness of a target. "He's eating," Jax said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick tried to violently yank his arm back, but Jax's grip was unyielding. The biker's thick fingers dug brutally into the tendons of Rick's wrist, applying a steady, excruciating pressure. "Let go of me, bikers," Rick snarled, though a distinct tremor of unease cracked his bravado. "This ain't club business, this is family." "Family," Jax repeated, tasting the word. It tasted like ash and bile. He glanced down at Eric. The kid was holding his breath, his terrified eyes locked onto Jax's hand gripping his abuser's arm. "Yeah, my kid. My rules," Rick spat, trying to regain his dominance. "Now, let go before me and my boy here make you regret it." Behind Rick, the wiry man shifted nervously, dropping his right hand to his pocket. Jax's sharp ears caught the unmistakable metallic snick of a switchblade opening. Jax sighed. It was a heavy, bone-deep sound of profound weariness. He hated this. He hated the noise, the posturing, the inevitable, sticky mess of violence. He was supposed to be riding back to the clubhouse, sleeping off the road grime on a questionable mattress. Instead, his muscles tensed, preparing for impact. He released Rick's wrist. Rick smirked, rubbing his reddened skin, his confidence instantly returning. "Smart choice. Come on, you little cripple." As Rick leaned in to grab Eric again, Jax pivoted his massive frame in the booth. His lower back screamed in sharp protest, an old stab wound flaring up, but he pushed through the sharp pain. He didn't bother using his fists. He brought the heavy, steel-reinforced heel of his combat boot up from the floor, driving it squarely and brutally into the side of Rick's planted knee. The wet crunch of tearing cartilage and snapping bone was sickeningly loud, echoing off the diner walls, followed instantly by a guttural, high-pitched roar of sheer agony. Rick collapsed like a felled tree, crashing into a neighboring table and taking down a chair as he hit the checkered floor, clutching his completely ruined leg. The wiry man lunged forward, the cheap blade flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jax caught the man's incoming forearm, twisted it sharply outward until the shoulder joint groaned, and slammed the man's face downward onto the hard edge of the formica table. Cartilage flattened, blood sprayed in a sudden messy arc across the white paper napkins. The man crumpled to the floor like a discarded rag, dropping the knife with a metallic clatter. The entire altercation lasted less than 5 seconds. Jax stood up slowly. His bad knee popped loudly. He looked down at the two men writhing on the sticky floor. The metallic smell of fresh blood instantly mixed with the scent of spilled, burnt coffee. Behind the counter, the waitress let out a delayed shriek, dropping a ceramic mug that shattered into a dozen sharp pieces across the tiles. Jax turned to Eric. The boy was frozen in place, his mouth hanging open, entirely unblinking. "Grab your brace," Jax said, his voice completely flat, devoid of adrenaline. Eric scrambled frantically to obey, his shaking hands fumbling with the metal straps. Jack stepped over the groaning wiry man and kicked the switchblade far under a distant booth. He looked down at Rick, who was sobbing openly, spit and tears mixing in his patchy beard as he held his deformed knee. "If I see you near this kid again," Jax leaned down, his voice a gravelly whisper that cut through the man's crying, "I won't stop at the knee. I'll take the whole leg. You understand me?" Rick nodded frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat. Jax turned back to the booth. He tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the table to cover the fries and the mess. He looked at the waitress, who was visibly trembling behind the cash register. "Call the cops in 10 minutes. Tell them these two tripped over a chair." He looked back at the boy. The kid was a massive liability. Jax was actively breaking club rules by getting involved in a civilian domestic dispute. The club president would be furious. He was inviting police scrutiny. It was a mistake. "Come on," Jax muttered, pushing the heavy diner door open with his shoulder. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling across the asphalt. "Let's go get your mom." Eric limped quickly after him, the heavy metal brace clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. As they stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain, Jax felt a strange, cold tightness in his chest. It wasn't regret. It was the terrifying, heavy realization that he had just adopted a war that wasn't his. Rainwater pooled in the deep, worn creases of Jax's leather saddle. He threw his right leg over the heavy machine, his bad knee grinding in silent protest against the damp cold. He didn't bother offering the kid a helmet. He didn't own a spare, and a heavy lid would snap Eric's scrawny neck if they went down on the slick asphalt anyway. "Climb up," Jax grunted, keeping his voice flat to mask the dull throb in his lower back. Eric struggled. His braced leg was a heavy, awkward pendulum of rusted steel and stiff leather straps. He grabbed the chrome sissy bar, his small knuckles white with effort, and hauled himself onto the passenger pillion. Jax felt the boy's tiny frame settle against his broad back like a stray bird landing on a boulder. "Hold onto my belt," Jax instructed over his shoulder. "You let go. You fall. You fall. You die. Understand?" "Yes, sir!" Eric shouted back, his voice instantly swallowed by the wind. Thin, trembling arms wrapped around Jax's waist, small fingers digging desperately into the thick leather of his gun belt. Jax kicked the starter. The massive V-twin engine erupted to life, a deafening, guttural roar that vibrated through Jax's boots and shot straight up his spine. He kicked the kickstand up, rolled the throttle, and dumped the clutch. The rear tire spun for a fraction of a second on the wet blacktop, kicking up a rooster tail of greasy water before finding purchase and launching them into the storm. The ride was miserable. The highway was a slick ribbon of black glass reflecting the harsh, scattered beams of oncoming headlights. Cold rain drove into Jax's face like tiny, frozen needles, finding the gaps between his collar and his thick beard. He smelled the raw ozone of the storm mixed with the sharp metallic tang of his engine running hot. Behind him, Eric was a vibrating mass of sheer terror and cold, his face pressed tightly against the embroidered death's head on Jax's cut. Jax didn't feel heroic. He felt like an idiot. Every mile they covered was a mile further from his warm bed at the clubhouse, a mile deeper into civilian garbage he had spent a decade avoiding. His mind calculated the risks with cold, cynical precision. Rick was a nobody, a violent drunk. But drunks talked. Drunks called the cops, and cops loved nothing more than harassing a patched member of the Hells Angels. He was jeopardizing his own freedom for a kid whose last name he didn't even know. "Next exit!" Eric yelled, his voice barely audible over the screaming wind and roaring exhaust. Jax banked the heavy bike hard, leaning into the sweeping curve of the off-ramp. The scenery shifted from desolate highway to crumbling industrial outskirts. Streetlights became sparse, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across cracked sidewalks. They turned into a sprawling, dilapidated trailer park nestled beneath a towering overpass. The air here was heavy, stinking of raw sewage, wet pine needles, and burning trash. Rusted husks of dead sedans littered the overgrown lawns. Feral cats darted under rotting skirting boards as the roar of Jax's exhaust shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. Eric pointed a shivering finger over Jax's shoulder toward the back row. Jax navigated the deep, mud-filled potholes, finally killing the engine in front of a faded, dented, single-wide trailer. The metal siding was peeling, and one of the front windows was patched with a greasy sheet of thick plastic and duct tape. Silence rushed back in, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the aluminum roof and the metallic tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. Jack stepped off the bike, boots sinking an inch into the soft, foul-smelling mud. He reached out and unceremoniously lifted Eric off the seat, setting him down. The boy stumbled, his bad leg giving out for a second, before he caught himself on the rusted handrail of the wooden stairs. "Front door's busted," Eric whispered, his eyes darting toward the dark windows of the neighboring trailers. "He kicked the lock out last week." Jax pushed past the kid, his hand resting instinctively on the heavy handle of the hunting knife at his belt. He placed his muddy boot against the flimsy fiberglass door and pushed. It gave way with a sad metallic scrape. The stench hit Jax like a physical blow. It was an overwhelming wave of stale cigarette smoke, sour spilled beer, unwashed laundry, and the sweet, sickening chemical scent of cheap prescription painkillers. The living room was a disaster zone. Smashed plates littered the cheap linoleum kitchen floor. A shattered lamp lay in the corner. The television buzzed loudly, displaying nothing but harsh black and white static, casting a manic flickering light over the squalor. On a sagging floral-patterned couch lay a woman. Jack stepped inside, the floorboards groaning dangerously under his massive weight. He was too big for this room, a dark, violent shape invading a space built for domestic misery. "Mom," Eric breathed, limping past Jax as fast as his brace would allow. He fell to his knees beside the couch, grabbing the woman's limp hand. "Mom, wake up." Jax stood near the door, scanning the shadows, his muscles tight. He looked at the woman. Rachel. She was thin, painfully so, her collarbones sharp against her pale skin. Dark, purple bruises marred her neck and cheekbones, some old and fading to yellow, others violently fresh. Her breathing was shallow, a wet rattling sound in the back of her throat. On the coffee table next to her rested 3 empty orange pill bottles and a half-empty handle of cheap vodka. Jax let out a harsh breath through his nose. He had seen junkies nod out in alleyways, seen men bleed out on warehouse floors. But the quiet, normalized devastation of this living room churned his stomach in a way he wasn't prepared for. He felt a sudden, violent urge to find Rick again and finish the job he'd started in the diner. "She won't wake up," Eric sobbed, shaking his mother's frail shoulder. Panic was rapidly replacing the adrenaline in the boy's voice. He gave her the blue pills again. Too many. Jax closed the broken door behind him, plunging the room back into the harsh glare of the static television. He walked over to the couch, his heavy boots crunching over broken glass. He shoved the coffee table aside with his knee, the empty bottles clattering to the floor. "Move," Jax ordered gruffly. He didn't wait for Eric to comply. He gripped Rachel's shoulders, his massive, scarred hands entirely enveloping her thin frame. He hauled her upward into a sitting position. Her head lolled back loosely on her neck. Jax slapped her cheek. Not a gentle tap, but a firm, sharp strike. Rachel gasped, her eyes flying open. Her pupils were blown wide, completely swallowing her irises. She looked wildly around the room, entirely uncomprehending, before her gaze locked onto the giant, leather-clad man looming over her. Genuine terror warped her bruised features, and she opened her mouth to scream. Jax clamped his calloused, grease-stained hand tightly over her mouth before the sound could escape. "Shut up!" Jax hissed, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised immediate violence. "I am not him. Do exactly what I say, or I leave you both here for him to find. Nod if you understand." Headlights suddenly swept across the thin, greasy curtains, throwing distorted, stretching shadows across the peeling wallpaper. A vehicle was turning down their narrow dirt lane. Jax instantly released Rachel's mouth. He dropped to a crouch, his bad knee popping loudly, and moved toward the window. He peeled back a tiny corner of the duct-taped plastic. A rusted, dark-colored pickup truck was crawling slowly through the mud, its high beams cutting through the heavy rain. "Is it him?" Eric whispered, his voice trembling so hard it cracked. He backed away from the window, shrinking against the cheap faux wood paneling of the hallway. "No," Jax muttered, his eyes tracking the truck. "It's a Ford." Rick and the other guy were walking. Someone else. "It's Tommy," Rachel rasped, her voice thick and slurred from the heavy sedatives. She gripped the edge of the couch, struggling to keep her head upright. "Rick's brother. He lives 3 trailers down. He always checks on me when Rick's gone." Jax cursed silently, a vicious string of expletives running through his mind. Rick had called for backup, or Tommy had just seen the motorcycle parked out front. Either way, the ticking clock had just hit 0. The truck rolled to a stop right behind Jax's bike, blocking them in. The engine idled rough, a low, menacing grumble in the dark. "Get up!" Jax ordered, turning away from the window. The cold calculation was back. He wasn't a savior anymore. He was a cornered animal, and he knew exactly how to fight his way out. "I can't," Rachel sobbed, her legs buckling entirely as she tried to stand. The drugs in her system made her limbs useless, dead weight. "My head is spinning. Leave me. Just take Eric." "Mom, no!" Eric cried out, lunging forward to grab her waist, trying futilely to hold her up. Jax felt a flare of pure, unadulterated rage. He hated the weakness, hated the pathetic sacrifice. He didn't do half measures. He wasn't going to drag a screaming kid out into the storm while leaving the mother behind to be beaten to death. "We don't have time for this," Jax snarled. A heavy, aggressive knock hammered against the broken front door, rattling it loosely in its frame. "Hey, Rick, you in there?" A gruff voice called out from the small wooden porch. "Saw a bike out front. Open up." Jax didn't hesitate. He grabbed Rachel by the waist, throwing her entirely over his broad left shoulder like a sack of grain. She let out a muffled groan of pain as her ribs dug into his collarbone, but Jax ignored it. His right hand drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt in one fluid, silent motion. The 6-inch steel blade gleamed dully in the television static. "Back door," Jax whispered to Eric. "Go, now." Eric scrambled down the narrow, trash-filled hallway toward the rear of the trailer. Jax followed, his heavy boots making entirely too much noise on the hollow floorboards. The weight of the woman on his shoulder threw off his center of gravity, sending a sharp, stabbing pain radiating up his damaged spine with every step. "Rick, I'm coming in!" the voice outside yelled. The front door groaned violently as someone shoved a shoulder against it. They reached the small kitchen at the back. Eric fumbled frantically with the deadbolt on the rear door. It was rusted tight. "It's stuck!" Eric whimpered in a panic, his fingers slipping on the cold brass. Behind them, the front door gave way with a loud crack of splintering fiberglass. Heavy boots stepped onto the linoleum in the living room. "What the hell?" the man muttered, likely seeing the overturned table and shattered glass. Jax shoved Eric aside. He didn't bother with the lock. He raised his heavy right boot and kicked backward, driving his steel-reinforced heel directly into the handle mechanism. The cheap aluminum door burst open, slamming hard against the exterior siding. Cold, biting rain instantly lashed against them. Jax pushed Eric out onto the small, rotting wooden deck, keeping Rachel hoisted firmly on his shoulder. He stepped out into the storm, the darkness swallowing them instantly. "Hey!" The shout came from inside the kitchen. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway toward the open back door. Jax didn't run straight into the yard. He dropped off the edge of the small deck, landing heavily in the thick, stinking mud beneath the trailer itself. He dragged Eric down with him by the collar of his corduroy jacket. "Under," Jax hissed, shoving the boy beneath the metal undercarriage of the mobile home. Jax threw himself down into the wet sludge next to the kid, pulling Rachel off his shoulder and dragging her into the suffocating darkness beneath the floorboards. The smell down here was atrocious, rotting wood, dead animals, and decades of damp decay. It coated Jax's throat, making him want to gag. He pressed his hand hard over Rachel's mouth again, ignoring her weak, confused struggles. Above them, the back door slammed open. Heavy boots stomped onto the wooden deck right over their heads. Dirt and splinters rained down through the cracks in the boards, dusting Jax's leather jacket. "Where the hell did they go?" the man muttered angrily, his voice muffled by the wood in the storm. A bright beam of a heavy flashlight swept out into the overgrown backyard, illuminating the rusted husks of cars and tall, wet weeds. The beam cut through the rain, missing the dark space beneath the deck entirely. Eric was shaking violently, his breath hitching in a terrifying prelude to a sob. Jax reached out in the dark, finding the boy's thin shoulder, and gripped it hard. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a physical command to stay silent. The man above them paced the deck for a painfully long minute. The heavy thud of his boots right above their heads sounded like cannon fire in Jax's ears. He calculated the angles. If the man looked down, if he shined the light beneath the skirts of the trailer, Jax would have to gut him. He tightened his grip on the handle of his knife, his thumb resting securely against the brass guard. He was ready to kill. The realization chilled him more than the freezing mud soaking through his jeans. Finally, the man spat into the mud, turned around, and walked back inside, slamming the busted door shut behind him. Jax didn't move. He lay in the freezing mud, his chest heaving, the rain washing the grease and dirt from his face. He listened until he heard the rough idle of the Ford truck shift into gear, its tires spinning in the mud before slowly crawling back down the dirt lane. Only then did Jax release his grip on Rachel's mouth. She gasped for air, coughing weakly into the damp earth. Jax slowly crawled out from beneath the trailer, hauling himself up to his feet. He was covered in foul-smelling slime from head to toe. His back screamed in agony, and his bad knee felt like it was filled with ground glass. He looked down at the boy, who was crawling out, dragging his heavy, mud-caked brace behind him. They were exposed. They had no vehicle, a drugged woman, a crippled boy, and a violent man actively hunting them down. Jax wiped the rain from his eyes and looked back at his motorcycle parked in the front. He couldn't take it. It was too loud, too identifiable. He had to leave a $30,000 custom chopper sitting in a garbage dump. "Come on," Jax rasped, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He reached down and hauled Rachel back onto his shoulder. "We're walking." "Where?" Eric asked, his voice a tiny, lost squeak in the massive storm. Jax looked out into the pitch-black, rain-soaked night. He was officially a ghost, a man running from his own shadow, dragging civilian dead weight into the dark. "Away," Jax said simply. And he began to walk, stepping off the edge of the property and into the sprawling, unforgiving darkness of the industrial sprawl. Rain battered the cracked pavement of the industrial sector, transforming deep potholes into treacherous, freezing pools of black water. Every step forward felt like wading through wet cement. Jax dragged his boots through the sludge, his lungs burning with a harsh, metallic ache. His left shoulder, bearing the dead weight of the unconscious woman, throbbed with a dull, nauseating rhythm. The strap of his heavy leather cut dug mercilessly into his collarbone. He tasted raw ozone, wet trash, and the bitter copper of his own exhaustion. Behind him, the relentless, chaotic rhythm of Eric's metal brace scraped against the gravel. Squelch, scrape, thud. It was the miserable soundtrack of their blind escape. Jax didn't look back. If he turned his head, he knew he would see the kid faltering. He would see the bruised, pale face twisted in agony, and it would only slow them down. Survival in this environment required a brutal, forward-facing momentum. Stopping meant freezing. Freezing meant dying. "Keep moving," Jax grunted, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. They navigated a maze of rusted chain-link fences and crumbling brick warehouses. The darkness was absolute. broken only by the sporadic, sickly yellow flashes of distant lightning. Jax's combat boots slipped on a patch of slick, oil-stained concrete. His bad knee buckled outward. A sharp, white-hot spike of pain shot directly up his thigh, forcing a sharp hiss through his clenched teeth. He stumbled, almost dropping Rachel into the toxic puddle at his feet. He caught his balance against a heavily oxidized iron beam, his heavy breathing echoing in the empty alleyway. His muscles trembled. He was a man built for short, explosive bursts of violence, not endurance treks through freezing mud while carrying a grown adult. "Mister!" Eric's voice was a fragile, high-pitched squeak behind him. "Don't stop!" Jax commanded harshly, pushing off the iron beam. They reached the edge of an abandoned rail yard. Skeletal remains of rotting freight cars sat on weed-choked tracks like massive rusted tombs. The smell here shifted from wet garbage to ancient oxidized iron and decaying wood. It was a graveyard of industry, completely isolated from the main roads. Jax scanned the line of dead trains. He needed a roof. His thick leather jacket was soaked through, the heavy material clinging to his skin like a freezing second layer of flesh. Rachel's breathing against his neck had become erratic, a shallow, wet rattle that warned of failing vitals. The sedatives in her system, combined with the extreme drop in body temperature, were pulling her into a dangerous downward spiral. He spotted a boxcar with a partially open sliding door. The heavy steel panel was rusted firmly onto its tracks, leaving a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Jax changed direction, marching heavily over the rotting wooden ties and crushed limestone ballast of the tracks. He reached the boxcar and peered into the pitch-black interior. It smelled of dry rot, stale dust and rat droppings, but it was dry, and the wind didn't howl inside. He shoved his broad shoulders through the rusted opening, turning sideways to fit Rachel through without scraping her against the jagged metal edges. He stepped down onto the wooden floorboards of the car. They creaked loudly under his massive weight. "Get in!" Jax ordered, turning back toward the opening. Eric struggled up the small metal ladder on the outside of the car. His hands, numb and completely white from the cold, slipped on the wet rungs. He let out a sharp cry as his bad leg swung outward, the heavy brace dragging him down. Jax cursed, leaning out into the rain. He grabbed the thick collar of the boy's corduroy jacket with his free hand and hauled him violently upward, dragging him through the opening and tossing him onto the dusty floorboards inside. Eric hit the wood hard, curling instantly into a tight, shivering ball. Jax stood in the heavy, suffocating darkness of the boxcar. The drumming of the rain against the curved metal roof was deafening, a relentless, chaotic percussion. He carefully lowered Rachel onto a pile of discarded heavy canvas tarps in the corner. Her limbs were entirely loose, her skin clammy and ice-cold to the touch. He collapsed against the corrugated iron wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. His massive chest heaved, pulling in the dusty, stale air. He rested his scarred hands on his knees, staring blindly into the pitch black. He had abandoned his custom chopper. He had assaulted 2 men. He was completely off the grid, freezing and actively babysitting a crippled kid and a comatose addict. Jax closed his eyes, pressing the back of his head against the freezing metal wall. He had broken every rule that kept him alive. And the worst part was, sitting in the absolute darkness of the ruined train, he knew he couldn't walk away now. Metal groaned above them as the wind hammered the side of the abandoned boxcar, a deep, hollow sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The absolute darkness inside was disorienting, broken only by a thin gray sliver of ambient light leaking through the rusted gap in the door. Jax sat completely still against the corrugated iron wall, letting the agonizing fire in his muscles slowly burn down to a dull, persistent throb. The air in the car was frigid, tasting heavily of dried rust and ancient grain dust. Every time he inhaled, the grit coated the back of his throat. Across the small space, the chaotic, rapid clicking of Eric's chattering teeth cut through the heavy drumming of the rain. The kid was shivering so violently that the rusted hinges of his leg brace rattled against the wooden floor. Jax reached into the inner pocket of his soaked leather cut. His fingers brushed against a heavy brass Zippo lighter. He pulled it out and flicked the wheel. The spark caught, and a small, bright yellow flame erupted, casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous interior of the boxcar. The light revealed the brutal reality of their situation. Eric was curled into a tight, miserable ball, hugging his knees to his chest. His lips were heavily tinted blue, his pale skin smeared with dark grease and wet mud. In the corner, Rachel lay perfectly still on the rotting canvas tarps. Her face was a terrifying chalky white, making the harsh purple bruises on her jaw and neck look aggressively prominent. Jack snapped the Zippo shut, plunging the car back into darkness. Fire meant light. Light meant a beacon for anyone hunting them. "Stop shaking," Jack said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rumble in the dark. I can't," Eric stammered, his voice hitched and broken by the violent tremors racking his small frame. "I'm so cold." Jax let out a long, tired exhale through his nose. He pushed himself off the floor, his bad knee popping loudly in protest. He blindly navigated the short distance in the dark, kneeling beside the boy. He grabbed the heavy waterlogged corduroy jacket by the lapels and yanked it violently off the kid's shoulders. Eric let out a panicked squeak, trying to pull away. "It's soaked! It's pulling your core temperature down," Jack stated coldly, tossing the heavy wet garment aside. He unbuckled his own heavy leather cut, the sacred patched armor of his club, and peeled it off. Beneath it, his black flannel shirt was damp, but the thick leather had protected him from the worst of the freezing rain. He blindly draped the massive leather vest over the boy. It swallowed Eric entirely, the heavy oil-tanned hide smelling strongly of stale tobacco, motor oil, and old sweat. It was a suffocating, terrifying smell, but it was thick, and it blocked the biting chill of the air. "Put your arms inside, curl up, breathe hot air into the collar," Jax instructed, moving away before the kid could offer any irritating gratitude. Jax crawled over to the pile of canvas. He reached out in the dark, his rough, calloused fingers finding the side of Rachel's neck. Her pulse was there, but it was terrifyingly slow and thready, a weak flutter beneath the cold skin. The heavy sedatives Rick had forced down her throat were suppressing her central nervous system. Combined with the cold, she was standing right on the razor's edge of completely shutting down. Jax pressed his thumbs hard into the hollows of her collarbones, applying sharp, localized pain. Rachel let out a weak, wet groan, her head tossing slightly on the canvas. "Wake up," Jax ordered, keeping his voice low but sharp. He slapped her cheek, not as hard as he had in the trailer, but enough to sting. "Open your eyes." Her eyelashes fluttered. In the faint gray light leaking from the door, Jack saw her pupils were still blown wide, but there was a microscopic spark of awful, terrified awareness returning. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound, and weakly tried to push his heavy hands away. "Where?" she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves crushing together. "Where is he?" "Eric is here. Rick is not," Jax answered flatly. He sat back on his heels, crossing his massive arms over his chest to preserve his own body heat. The damp cold of his flannel shirt was beginning to bite into his skin. Rachel struggled to prop herself up on her elbows. She failed, collapsing back onto the foul-smelling canvas. "My head. It feels packed with wet cotton. Why did you take us? You should have just taken my boy." "Because I don't do half a job," Jax replied, his tone devoid of any warmth. "And because leaving you meant leaving a witness who would wake up and tell a very angry man exactly what direction a biker and a crippled kid went." It was a lie. A cold, calculated lie to mask the uncomfortable truth that he simply couldn't stomach leaving her to be beaten to death on a stained linoleum floor. Rachel let out a bitter, exhausted sound that was entirely devoid of humor. "He's going to kill you. You don't know what you stepped into, mister. I broke his leg backward. I think I have a decent idea." "No, you don't," Rachel whispered. She turned her head, her haunted, sunken eyes locking onto Jax's shadowy silhouette. Rick isn't just a drunk. He cooks. He cooks out of the old shed behind the trailer park. That money Eric found, the stash, it wasn't Rick's. It was the cartel's float money for the raw pseudoephedrine. The silence in the boxcar suddenly felt immensely heavy, pressing down on Jax's chest like a physical weight. The drumming rain outside seemed to fade into a dull background hum. Jax slowly closed his eyes. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying mathematical precision. Rick wasn't hunting them out of wounded pride or domestic control. He was hunting them because he was a dead man if he didn't recover that money. And he had enlisted his brother and likely every low-level dealer in the county to find the kid who took it. "How much?" Jax asked, his voice dead flat. 40,000! Eric's voice piped up from the dark corner, muffled heavily by the thick leather of Jax's cut. "In thick bands. I put it in my backpack. It was hidden under the floorboards." Jax felt a terrifying cold knot tighten in his gut. A domestic dispute was a police matter. Stealing $40,000 of cartel operation money was a death sentence. He had walked into a diner to drink bad coffee, and he had walked out carrying a massive ticking bomb. "Where's the backpack?" Jax asked carefully. "I left it," Eric sobbed, the sound pathetic and small. "When Rick came home early and caught me by the window, I dropped it in the mud under the porch to squeeze through the frame. I just wanted to buy us bus tickets." Jax leaned his head back against the freezing iron wall. The money was still at the trailer, which meant Rick would find it. But Rick still needed a scapegoat. He needed to prove to his suppliers that he hadn't tried to run with the cash. He needed the boy to parade in front of dangerous men to explain the delay. They weren't just fugitives from a petty domestic abuser anymore. They were loose ends in a violent, high-stakes narcotic supply chain. Jax rubbed his heavily scarred jaw, feeling the coarse bristles of his beard. He looked at the shivering lump of leather in the corner, and then at the broken, drugged woman gasping on the floor. He was a Hell's Angel. His brothers would back him in a war against any gang, any cartel, on any given day. But not for this. He had broken club protocol by bringing this heat down on himself for civilians. If he called his president now, he would be stripped of his patch and left to the wolves. He was entirely alone. Jax reached down to his belt in the dark. He unclasped the leather sheath and slid the heavy hunting knife out. He ran his thumb carefully over the cold, razor-sharp edge of the steel. He didn't offer any comforting words to the woman or the child. He simply stared at the thin sliver of gray light at the door, waiting for the shadows outside to finally come alive. Heavy diesel vibrations shuddered through the rotting floorboards long before the halogen high beams sliced through the boxcar's rusted doorway. Jax didn't move. He kept his breathing shallow, listening intently to the crunch of heavy tires rolling over crushed limestone. Beside him, Rachel's rattling breaths weakened with every passing minute, while Eric remained a completely silent, shivering lump buried under the massive leather cut in the corner. Footsteps crunched outside in the wet gravel. 2 sets. "Check the cars," a cold, even voice commanded over the driving rain. It wasn't the slurred, messy anger of a local drunk. It was the terrifyingly calm, balanced cadence of a professional, a cartel enforcer. "Look for fresh tracks in the mud." "Got it," a second voice replied, shaking slightly. Tommy. Rick's brother. Jax tightened his massive scarred fist around the bone handle of his hunting knife. The heavy steel felt like a block of ice against his palm. If they cornered him inside this iron box, the enclosed space was a death trap. A single stray bullet would ricochet off the corrugated walls and tear the kid to pieces. He had to take the violence outside into the storm. He squeezed his broad shoulders through the rusted gap in the door, stepping out into the freezing deluge. Instead of dropping directly to the gravel, he reached up, his thick fingers gripping the rusted lip of the boxcar's roof. Agony flared blindingly in his damaged lower back as he hauled his 240-pound frame upward, pressing his wet chest flat against the freezing metal roof. Below him, Tommy's flashlight beam swept erratically across the wet limestone. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The bright yellow beam hit the rusted door Jax had just exited. "Hey, door's open on this one." Jax slipped his hand into his soaked jeans pocket, his fingers finding a heavy steel hex nut he carried for moments exactly like this. He flicked it backward over his shoulder. It hit the adjacent train car with a sharp metallic clack. Tommy flinched, violently swinging his flashlight toward the noise, stepping right up to the edge of the boxcar. Jax dropped from the roof. He fell completely silently, a massive deadly shadow collapsing from the sky directly onto Tommy's back. The brutal impact drove the man face first into the gravel with a sickening crunch of breaking facial bones. The heavy flashlight shattered instantly. Tommy twitched once, totally limp, before Jax drove the heavy steel pommel of his knife hard into the base of the man's skull to ensure he stayed down. "Tommy!" the enforcer called out from the front of the idling truck. The coldness in his voice immediately hardened into lethal tactical suspicion. Jax rolled off the body. He tasted dark copper where he had bitten his own tongue during the fall. He dropped flat onto his stomach in the toxic sludge between the tracks. The mud instantly soaked through his flannel shirt, chilling his skin to the bone marrow. He dragged himself under the undercarriage of the train, inching his way through decades-old grease and raw sewage, navigating entirely by touch. He emerged on the opposite side, slipping silently into the dark blind spot right behind the enforcer's idling truck. The enforcer advanced methodically toward Tommy's prone body. He moved with a tight two-handed grip on a suppressed matte black pistol, using the truck's headlights to blind anything in front of him. He was thoroughly scanning the darkness, completely unaware of the mud-caked giant rising up right behind his back. Jax lunged out of the shadows. Peripheral vision caught the movement. The enforcer spun with terrifying trained speed, bringing the muzzle of the pistol up to center mass. Jax slammed his heavy left forearm into the man's wrist, violently forcing the gun upward just as the trigger broke. The suppressed shot was a harsh mechanical hiss. A bullet tore cleanly through the collar of Jax's flannel shirt, grazing his collarbone with a sudden white-hot burn. Ignoring the searing pain, Jax drove the 6-inch steel blade aggressively upward. It slid smoothly under the enforcer's ribs, angling sharply up into the heart. The man gasped, a horrible wet choke. His pistol clattered uselessly onto the limestone. His eyes locked onto Jax's dead empty stare as his legs gave out. Jax twisted the heavy bone handle, breaking the internal suction, and brutally ripped the blade free. The enforcer collapsed backward into the mud, staring blankly up at the relentless rain, his hands weakly grasping his ruined chest before his eyes clouded over completely. Jax stood alone in the storm. His chest heaved in ragged, wheezing gasps. Blood dripped down his neck from the bullet graze, mixing with the freezing rain. He stared at his violently trembling hands. He had just murdered a cartel enforcer over a bruised kid he met drinking bad diner coffee. He wiped his blade clean on the dead man's black slicker, sheathed it, and scooped the dropped pistol from the gravel. He shoved it into his waistband. The rail yard was completely silent again, save for the low hum of the idling diesel engine. Jax turned his back on the corpses and limped heavily back toward the rusted boxcar door. The hardest part wasn't the killing. It was figuring out how to keep the survivors breathing until dawn. The storm broke just as the first bruised purple light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon. The rain slowed to a misty drizzle, leaving the industrial wasteland smelling sharply of wet ozone, diesel exhaust, and cold mud. Jax kicked the heavy steel door of the boxcar open a few more inches. The harsh morning light poured in, illuminating the squalor. "Get up," Jax grated, his voice hoarse and completely devoid of warmth. In the corner, the massive pile of black leather shifted. Eric poked his head out, his face utterly pale, his hazel eyes wide and terrified. He looked at Jax, taking in the mud-caked jeans, the torn and bloodied flannel shirt, and the dark, hollow exhaustion carving deep lines into the biker's face. "Are they?" Eric started, his voice a tiny, broken whisper. "They're gone," Jax interrupted coldly. He didn't offer details. He didn't want the kid processing the reality of the corpses rotting in the gravel outside. "Help your mother." Jax walked over to Rachel. He didn't bother slapping her awake this time. He grabbed her completely limp arms, hauled her upward, and threw her over his uninjured right shoulder. The sharp agony in his back was a constant, blinding white noise now, something he simply forced his brain to ignore. He carried her out of the boxcar and dumped her unceremoniously into the passenger seat of the enforcer's idling gray truck. He slammed the door shut, ignoring her weak groan. Eric dragged himself out of the boxcar, his heavy brace clicking rhythmically. He stopped, his eyes locking onto the dark, pooling stains in the limestone near the rear tires. "Don't look!" Jax commanded, grabbing the back of the kid's corduroy collar and steering him toward the rear door of the crew cab. "Get in! Keep your head down!" Eric scrambled into the back seat, pulling his braced leg in after him. Jax climbed into the driver's seat. It smelled entirely of expensive cologne and old cigarettes. He reached over the center console, retrieved a thick leather wallet from the dead man's jacket which he had tossed onto the passenger floorboard, and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. He didn't count it. He reached back and tossed the wad of cash onto Eric's lap. "Bus station is 40 miles west," Jack said, shifting the heavy truck into gear. "Buy 2 tickets to anywhere that isn't here. You don't call anyone. You don't come back." The drive was entirely silent. The heater blasted hot, dry air through the cab, slowly thawing the ice from their bones. Jax drove with dead-eyed focus, his massive, scarred hands gripping the leather steering wheel tightly. He watched the rear-view mirror constantly, waiting for the flashing lights of a patrol car or the blacked-out SUVs of cartel retaliation. Nothing followed them but the gray morning mist. An hour later, Jax pulled the truck up to the curb of a desolate Greyhound station on the absolute outskirts of the county line. The neon sign buzzed weakly in the morning light. He threw the truck into park. He didn't cut the engine. "Out," Jax ordered. Rachel was semi-lucid now, the adrenaline of the ride cutting through the heavy sedatives. She looked at Jax, her eyes tracking the blood dried on his neck, the mud caked into his beard. She didn't say thank you. She recognized the profound, violent darkness in the man sitting next to her, and she knew gratitude was completely out of place. She just opened the door and stumbled out onto the cracked concrete. Eric climbed out of the back. He stood on the curb, his oversized corduroy jacket hanging off his thin frame. The rusted brace squeaked as he shifted his weight. He looked at the thick wad of cash in his hand, and then up at the giant, terrifying man behind the glass of the truck window. Jax rolled the window down halfway. He rested his thick, heavily tattooed arm on the sill. "Mister," Eric said, his voice stronger now, grounded by the cold morning air. "Why did you let me sit with you?" Jax stared at the kid. He thought about the dead men in the rail yard. He thought about his abandoned motorcycle. He thought about the absolute hell his club president was going to unleash on him when he finally answered his phone. He looked at his own scarred, violent hands. "Because I didn't want to drink my coffee alone," Jax lied smoothly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't wait for a response. Jax rolled the window up, severing the connection completely. He dropped the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb without looking back. He merged onto the empty highway, heading entirely in the opposite direction. The road ahead was long, dangerous, and completely empty. Jax reached into his blood-stained pocket, pulled out a crushed cigarette, and finally lit it with his heavy brass Zippo. He took a long drag, filling his lungs with the harsh, bitter smoke. He was a monster returning to the dark, but as he watched the sun finally break through the heavy gray clouds, he realized he didn't hate the silence quite as much as he used to. What a brutal, unforgettable ride. Jax's decision to cross the line and protect Eric pushed him to the absolute limit, proving that true grit isn't about being a hero. It's about doing what has to be done when the world turns completely dark. The storm may have passed, but the scars they carry will last a lifetime. If this raw, unapologetic story kept you on the edge of your seat, you know exactly what to do. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video with anyone who craves deep, grounded storytelling, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next intense narrative. Stay gritty, and we'll see you in the next one.